You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Choice Hotels get you more of what you value. Comfort Inn, it's calling your name. Save on the stay. Oh, and free waffles are yours to claim. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 259, Crete Part 4, Naval Victory, Naval Disaster. This week, a big thank you goes out to Ralph, Nathan, Wolf3, and Blake for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. As night fell on the island of Crete on May 20th, 1941, on the German side, the decision would soon be made to double down on their invasion, even though very few things had gone according to plan on the first day. None of the primary objectives had been accomplished by the first waves of German paratroopers and gliders during the day of the 20th, and it seemed like there was a real chance that the entire operation would be a failure. There was legitimate concern by many German officers that it was just over. However, on the British side, the views held by some of the higher-level officers on the island were just as dire as those held by German officers on Crete. There were two primary problems faced by General Freyberg, the leader of all German forces on Crete. The first was the problem of communications. It was very challenging for Freyberg and other British officers to get a good handle on what exactly was happening across the various areas of Crete where the fighting was occurring. And due to the chaotic nature of that fighting, which was very typical of airborne operations, it was even hard for officers closer to the front to know what was happening in their sectors. Radios had a tendency to malfunction, and even when they did work correctly, incorrect information was often passed up the chain. This meant that there were all kinds of different rumors floating around on the British side, from the idea that the Germans had brought in forces to build their own airfield in Prison Valley, to aircraft having landed in the Tavernidis riverbed west of Malmö. This challenge would result in Freyberg sending this message to British command in Cairo to summarize the day's events. Quote, "Today was a hard one. We have been hard-pressed. So far, I believe we hold aerodromes at Rethemno, Heraklion, and Malmö, and the two harbors. Margin by which we hold them is a bare one, and it would be wrong for me to point an optimistic picture. Fighting has been heavy, and we have killed large numbers of Germans. Communications are most difficult." End quote. Now, he was correct about Malmö and how difficult it would be and how close the Germans were to capturing the airfield. But at Rethemno and Heraklion, the Germans were nowhere close to being able to even threaten the airfields in those sectors. The other problem that Freyberg faced was one of his own making, and that was the possible threat of a seaborne invasion. Freyberg was laser-focused on the threat posed by a German attack from the sea, and that caused him to ignore the suggestions of some of his staff to launch immediate counterattacks on all of the German forces on land. To do so would require the commitment of reserves, and Freyberg was saving those for use against the seaborne landings, the landings that would never come. The status of the seaborne reinforcements and the impact that their presence would have on British planning would be an important driver of events on Crete in the days that followed the initial actions. The Germans would frantically race airlifted reinforcements onto the island because their men were heavily outnumbered, while the British leaders refused to take advantage of their numerical superiority due to fears of other attacks that would never come. This episode will discuss that naval threat and the actions on May 20th and the 21st, which would prove that there was never a serious threat of a seaborne invasion, or at least the Royal Navy would do its very best to make sure there was never a serious threat of a seaborne invasion. While most of the fighting in Greece and on Crete would take place between forces on the ground, the Royal Navy would play a critical role in all of the fighting in the Eastern Mediterranean during this period of the war, and by May 20th, 1941, there were both positive and negative developments for the fleet under command of Admiral Cunningham. On the positive side of the ledger, the Mediterranean had been reinforced in the months before Crete, bringing Cunningham's strength up to 4 battleships of the Queen Elizabeth class and the new aircraft carrier Formidable. These capital ships were also accompanied by a large number of cruisers and destroyers, which would be just as important to the fighting around Crete, where the primary threat was posed by the Luftwaffe. There were 6 ships that were designated as anti-aircraft cruisers, 3 of which were updated World War I era cruisers, and 3 were new vessels of the Dido class. The idea was that these ships would be equipped with as much anti-aircraft capability as possible, and then when they were in the fleet, they would be able to use that fire against attacks from the air. The old cruisers of the Carlisle class relied primarily on 4-inch guns and 50 caliber machine guns, both of which were simply not very good, actually, against the high-performance aircraft used by the Luftwaffe. They didn't have the range, velocity, or hitting power to truly protect from air attacks in 1941. The newer Dido class were equipped with more effective guns, a newer 5.25-inch dual-purpose gun, which was chosen due to its surface fire and anti-aircraft capabilities, but there were other issues with the Didos, the most important of which was that some of them were a turret short, with 4 twin turrets instead of 5 twin turrets, due to a lack of availability on the guns that they would put in those turrets during initial construction. This meant that they had only about 80% of their intended firepower, which was of course not ideal. The guns they did have performed relatively well, although they were hampered by the same challenges that the Royal Navy would have throughout the early war years. One of these was the fact that the Royal Navy had not done a good job at developing the kind of high-angle fire control systems that were essential when trying to shoot down the very fast aircraft that they were facing in 1941. High-angle fire control is a system that was developed to automatically aim and fire guns at incoming aircraft, primarily due to the fact that the best way to shoot down an aircraft was not to have individual gunners looking through sights, but instead to coordinate as much fire as possible on a single target using the best possible range and speed estimates gained by instruments, not the human eye. The problem that the Royal Navy had was that there were fundamental issues with their high-angle fire control systems that would make them less effective. They had been designed in the early and mid-1930s, when aircraft, particularly naval strike aircraft, were slower, lower flying, and more predictable in their attack runs. This caused the British systems to have issues as aircraft got faster because they were unable to properly predict fast enough where the enemy aircraft would be for the guns to fire at that point. Obviously, you had to lead them. Any issues with these calculations would result in all of the fire missing the attacker, either leading them too much or, much more frequently, firing behind them. The systems would also have serious problems with dive bombers, which was an issue shared by many other navies at this time. Trying to hit a dive bomber on their way down was an incredibly challenging issue due to the speed of their descent and their angle to the ship. Unfortunately for the Royal Navy off Crete, one of the Luftwaffe's primary attack aircraft just so happened to be one of the better dive-bombing aircraft in the world at this time, the Stuka. These issues with fire control did not make the British ships useless at anti-aircraft fire, but it certainly reduced their impact, and this reduction in effectiveness would be compounded by the fact that few ships of the Royal Navy had enough of the right kinds of anti-aircraft guns in 1941. There were many guns that were older and smaller than what was needed, with shorter range and less power than what would have been preferred. And this would be a recurring problem throughout the entire Mediterranean campaign from 1940 into 1942. There were simply never enough of the newest, best anti-aircraft guns to go around for the Royal Navy, and this meant that for much of the war, many ships were dealing with technology from the 1920s and early 1930s, which was clearly showing its age by 1941. Now, there would almost always be at least one aircraft carrier with the Eastern Mediterranean fleet, but the carrier that was in theater at the time of the Crete invasion, the Formidable, had precisely 4 fighter aircraft on board due to attrition and a complete lack of replacement aircraft. Obviously, this meant that the Formidable could not provide the kind of defense from enemy aircraft that was hoped. 4 fighters don't go very far. If the Royal Navy was lacking anti-aircraft capabilities, what they were not lacking was in the belief that it was essential that they support the Army, whatever the situation. This had been proven multiple times over the first 2 years of the war, and Admiral Cunningham made it clear that Crete would not be any different. On May 22nd, when the Royal Navy ships were under daily air attacks around the island, he would send out the message that they had to, quote, stick it out. Navy must not let the Army down. Then on May 26th, he would be quoted as saying, "It has always been the duty of the Navy to take the Army overseas to battle, and if the Army fails, to bring them back again. To try and achieve the goal of protecting Crete as much as possible and being in position to support the army, Cunningham would create 4 different task forces, with 3 of them being built around cruisers and destroyers positioned to the northwest, north, and northeast of Crete. It would be these forces that were best in position to protect from the possibility of an amphibious attack. However, they were not continuously positioned to the north of the island, and really they were only in those positions at night. During the darkness hours, they would move through the areas in a series of sweeps to check for German ships, and then they would move to the south during the daylight hours. This was required due to the presence of the Luftwaffe, particularly in the days before the invasion began. Then, to the west of Crete, a larger force was built around the battleships Queen Elizabeth and Barham, and they were positioned to protect against the possible attack of the Italian Navy. Then, a collection of ships was also positioned back in Alexandria as a reserve force and as a source for re-emplacements for ships in the other groups. This was essential because ships would have to make their way back to Alexandria every few days for refueling and resupply. These perfectly organized groupings would not last very long once the fighting started, but they give a good view of what was considered to be important for the Royal Navy, which was to try and prevent any German naval forces from reaching the island, while also protecting against the possibility of the Italian Navy becoming involved. Placing these groups to the north of the island was also aggressive positioning, signifying that at least the Royal Navy was prepared to fight for Crete, and was not just standing by to help the army get off the beaches, if they needed to do that once again. On the night of May 19th and into the morning of the 20th, the groups of Royal Navy ships had done their scheduled nighttime sweeps north of the island, just as they had done over the previous days. Then when Cunningham was informed that the first German forces had landed on the island, he made the decision to move his groups closer to Crete, although they were south of the island, after having completed their nighttime operations. Throughout the chaotic day of May 20th, little specific information was communicated to Cunningham, although it was clear that a major German invasion was underway. May 21st would be the first day of crisis for the Royal Navy because throughout the day, various air attacks would be made against groups of Royal Navy ships by both Italian and German aircraft. The Royal Navy and the Axis Air Forces were both trying to keep the other from doing what they were trying to do. For the Royal Navy, their entire goal was to stay close enough to Crete, but south of the island, so that they would be in position for their normal nighttime patrols. The further south of the island they retreated, the safer they were from air attack, but the further south they were during the day, the more likely it was that they would not be able to be in position at night to the north of Crete to meet any possible German transport convoy. For the Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica, who assisted them, they just wanted to try and drive the Royal Navy as far south as possible through constant air attack. That way, they would be too far south to interdict the convoys that were planned for the night of May 21st and into the 22nd. This push and pull would play out over several days during the Battle of Crete. On the 21st, the hardest hit groups would be forces C and D, with the destroyer Juno of Force C sinking very shortly after having been hit by Italian bombs, with a loss of 116 sailors. While there were losses, most of the air attacks were unsuccessful at causing serious damage to the Royal Navy ships, and they were mostly able to remain in position for their nighttime patrols. However, the constant attacks throughout the day presented a different problem for many ships. They were running out of anti-aircraft ammunition. Of course, every ship only carried a certain number of shells or a certain amount of ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns, and the multiple attacks launched throughout the day cut heavily into their magazines. This meant that even if they were able to do their nighttime operations, if they were met again the next day by further strong air attacks, they might have issues defending themselves, and that would play a major role in what would happen on May 22nd.
Adobe Firefly is the all-in-one creative studio with AI-powered image and video editing for today's creative process. Built for creators of every kind, Firefly helps you generate, edit, and experiment fast. Because the asks aren't getting smaller, the budgets aren't getting bigger, and the timelines, oh yeah, still tight. With all the best creative AI models in one place, Firefly brings your ideas to life. Unlock a better way to make with Adobe Firefly.
Many historians, and this very podcast, have criticized Freyberg and his decisions about how to defend Crete from the German attack. This criticism generally revolves around how he viewed the possible invasion threats, with his emphasis being placed on defending against a seaborne invasion instead of an airborne operation. But Freyberg was not completely wrong. The Germans did plan on reinforcing the airborne troops on Crete through the use of seaborne convoys. In fact, on the night of May 21st, the first of these would attempt to make their way to Crete. What Freyberg got wrong was the relative emphasis that he believed the Germans were placing on each of the two operations. On the German side, the convoys were reinforcements and supplies for their primary effort, which was coming in on aircraft. Freyberg believed that it was from the sea that the primary effort would be launched, and the airborne forces were just a distraction. This decision-making process would greatly influence the structure and evolution of British defense on land, although it would not really impact the actions of the Royal Navy at sea. Their goal was to prevent any German ships from reaching Crete. Pretty much as simple as that. A pretty straightforward objective, which was of course a bit more complicated than it might additionally sound. The key issue was that British ships could not stay north of Crete during the day. They would be too vulnerable to German air attacks. But that was not as much of a problem as it could have been, because the German convoys would take time to reach Crete, and there would always be an opportunity for the Royal Navy to intercept those convoys north of Crete during the night hours. And this exactly would happen on the night of May 21st. The first small convoy of German reinforcements was a collection of 19 fishing ships and 2 old steamers that would be given the grand-sounding title of the first Motor Sailing Flotilla. On board were the 3rd Battalion of the 100th Mountain Regiment, roughly 2,300 men or so, along with large amounts of ammunition and some anti-aircraft batteries. The ammunition was a critical part of the convoy, with ships being the only way to efficiently transport ammunition in the quantities needed from mainland Greece to Crete. The goal was to offload the men and ammunition on a beach near Malame so that they could reinforce the area of greatest German success. The convoy was escorted by precisely one military ship, the Italian light cruiser Lupo, which would take over the escort job near the island of Milos, which was 30 miles or just under 50 kilometers from Crete. Unfortunately for the men aboard the ships and the Lupo itself, the entire operation would be spotted by a British reconnaissance plane in the late afternoon of the 21st. This was not a random sighting, though, and in fact Cunningham had been provided with ultra-level intelligence that the convoy had set sail and was bound for Malame. But the goal was always to protect Ultra, and so the reconnaissance plane was positioned to spot the convoy as if it occurred accidentally. This was a common setup for the British in the Mediterranean, and it was not the first or the last time that the Italians and Germans would suffer from what appeared to be really, really bad luck, when in fact it was due to their compromised communications. The reconnaissance aircraft would provide the exact information that Cunningham and the Royal Navy had been waiting for. They had just spent the entirety of the first day of the Crete operation under constant air attack, just so that they could be in position to react to this information. The plan had always been to execute a night sweep of the waters north of Crete, but now there was a specific target for the operation. The plan was to use Force D under Rear Admiral Glennie for the interception, with the force including 3 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. There was nothing that the Lupo could do if these ships intercepted the convoy. Just after 10:30 p.m., that interception would happen, with the British ships coming into contact with the convoy and the Lupo spotting one of the British destroyers. The transports were quickly turned around and started heading back north, and the Lupo moved in position to try and slow the British to give them time to escape. The Italian ship would fire some torpedoes, and it began firing at the British ships, but very quickly the British cruisers closed in and unleashed their vastly superior firepower at very close range. Remarkably, Lupo did not actually sink, mostly because many of the British shells passed completely through the destroyer without exploding. Then the cruisers and destroyers closed in on the German transports. At least 8 of the vessels were sunk, and more probably would have been destroyed except for the fact that their civilian construction of thin wooden hulls meant, again, most British fire went straight through them without exploding. It must have been a terrifying experience for the German mountain troops who could do nothing other than hope that they ended up okay, I guess. Remarkably, only 327 Germans were killed due to the rescue that would happen during the next day by other smaller German vessels and seaplanes. The British, of course, had to vacate the area as quickly as possible after their attack due to the coming morning hours and the inevitable Luftwaffe attacks. During this action, only 2 British sailors would be killed and another 9 wounded, all on the cruiser Orion, which had been hit from some of Lupo's 20mm guns. While the first troop convoy had been intercepted and forced to turn back, it was not even the largest group of ships that were on their way to Crete on the night of May 21st and the morning of the 22nd. This would instead be the ships of the second Motor Sailing Flotilla, with this flotilla made up of 30 fishing ships and steamers escorted by another small Italian torpedo boat, the Sagittario. The news of the interception of the first convoy had quickly arrived back at German command back in Greece, and it was decided that the Sagittario convoy needed to turn around and run away as fast as possible. This was very fortunately for them because there was another British force, Force C, commanded by Rear Admiral King, which was hunting for them in the early hours of May 22nd. It was a race against time, though, but it was a race that involved more than just the ships that were at sea. Force C would not spot the Sagittario until almost 9 a.m. on the 22nd, and it was between the British and the convoy. Just like the earlier action against the Lupo, the Sagittario had no chance against 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers that the British had brought with them, but it could delay the chase, and it would do so by laying a smokescreen and opening fire on the British ships. Torpedoes would then be launched, which forced the British cruisers to turn around. At this point, King's ships absolutely could have just run down the transports. It was modern military cruisers against fishing ships. It would not have been a fair fight. But every single moment that King chased the retreating convoy, the closer his ships came to the Luftwaffe's airfields in Greece, and every minute spent going north would be another minute that they would be in the danger zone throughout the morning as they tried to move south. The Luftwaffe would quickly find King's group and begin shadowing the ships with reconnaissance aircraft throughout the day. The first attackers were 12 Ju-88 bombers, which did not do any damage, but they were just the first of many. King's ships, when they were all together, could throw up a tremendous amount of anti-aircraft fire, which gave them some protection, but there was nothing they could do to prevent German aircraft from attacking time and time again. The afternoon of the 22nd would end up being something of a disaster for the Royal Navy, not just because of King's group, but also what would happen as other Royal Navy forces were attacked by the Luftwaffe. Throughout the afternoon, the destroyer Greyhound would be hit, then the cruisers Gloucester and Fiji were sent in to assist, and then the Gloucester would be hit with 85 of the 807 men on board surviving. Then a few hours later, the Fiji would be lost after being attacked by a single German bomber. In both cases, one of the primary causes of the disaster was the fact that by the afternoon of the 22nd, some of the British ships were literally running out of anti-aircraft ammunition, and that included the Fiji. When the Fiji was hit by a single German bomber, there was no anti-aircraft fire because there was no ammunition. The Warspite would also be hit and damaged, along with 2 other cruisers. It would be a day on which the Royal Navy absolutely paid the price for insisting on being in position to stop the German convoys. Over 1,000 men of the Royal Navy were lost, but the 2 German flotillas were turned around, and so you could probably classify it as a success, I guess. Next episode, we will shift our focus back to the island of Crete as the British forces try to counterattack, emphasis on try, and then the situation seems to very quickly start falling apart for the defenders, although some of that was maybe in their own minds.